Hi, my name is Christine Wise, and this is my final project. It is our Module 9 case study for educational leadership class. All right, so in this case study, it presents a very clear question of doing what is ethical and what is best for students versus following a zero tolerance board policy, as well as laws regarding possession of weapons on school grounds. So, who is in the case study? So, first is Mr. Richard Inman, who is the assistant principal, and this is his first year in that position. James is a student who has struggled quite a bit previously, and he has been working very closely with Mr. Inman on just kind of, being present at school, keeping up with his grades. So, Mr. Inman has really invested a lot of interest in James and supporting him. And he also, it's having a very positive impact on James. He is from an area of town that has some struggles, and so therefore, Mr. Inman, he felt very inclined to step up for James and support him, being that he also is from that same area. David Ramos is the student who participated in the issue, and he was never in trouble before. He was an honor student, a musician, and ultimately was a victim of what happened here with James. The teacher is in the case study who initially witnessed the exchange between James and David, and then therefore alerted Mr. Inman. The parents are involved. I say parents, but it was only mentioned the mothers of both. But wanted to include just in case there were fathers present. And then the school resource officer is also involved. The school resource officer was immediately part of the conversation initially with the boys. Okay, who else continued? So, didn't say this, but in any situation like this in a school district, you would also have the central office team. So, therefore, the Board of Education, they're involved because they are the ones who have created the policies in which Mr. Inman is being asked to enforce. And then you're going to have HR, human resources, the superintendent, and then the person who was mentioned is the director of secondary education. And so the director is the one who spoke to Mr. Inman about possibly receiving consequences if he didn't follow through with what was being asked of him. Where are we? This is Rocket Junior High. It has 900 students, so I would say a pretty large school. Incidents happened in the hallway, and then also in Mr. Inman's office is where conversations took place. We don't get mention of like a specific city, but they do mention an area of town, which is South Side, and that is where James is from. And then also the youth detention facility, which the boys were taken there immediately after the incident. When is it? We know it's a spring day. We know that this all occurred during fifth period, and then also the events occur a week post-incident. Okay, sorry. All right, so to summarize this, like I said, this case presents a clear question of doing what is ethical and best for students versus following school tolerance policies and laws regarding possessions of weapons on school grounds. So, what happened in this situation? So, Mr. Inman, like I said, he's been investing in James quite a bit to support him and to help him make a lot of growth and progress as a student, and ultimately try to set him up for success in his adult life. And he's having a very positive impact on James. James has been doing better in his classes and attending school and hasn't been in trouble in quite a bit. So what happened was this week, James had multiple tardies, which prompted Mr. Inman to call him into his office. And so post this conversation with Mr. Inman, the fifth period teacher of James witnessed him exchanging some kind of items with another student in the hallway. That student was David Ramos. And what she said was that she felt like maybe they were exchanging drugs and that David looked nervous. So that prompted Mr. Inman to immediately contact the resource officer, who was brought the boys out of class. They questioned both of the students at the same time with the resource officer present. And in this questioning, it became necessary that David would be searched because he was asked if he had anything on him, and he said no. And the school resource officer did search him and find weapons that he was carrying. And we discovered because James had threatened him to do so. So he had asked David to carry these weapons for him until the end of the day, and he threatened to physically harm him if he did not comply. David, like I said before, has never been in trouble, is an honor student. They mentioned their ages later. So David is 13 and James is 15. So he's definitely younger as well. So he did comply, didn't tell an adult. And therefore, what ends up happening is that due to the school board's zero tolerance policy, the resource officer, he has to arrest both boys because of the policy, as well as they violated a felony possession of unauthorized weapons on school grounds. So the school resource officer is required to follow through with his responsibilities as well. So we have an issue of law and an issue of board policy. So both boys are taken to the detention center, even though James, he shared that David actually was only holding the weapons because James had threatened him. Both parents were contacted. Like I said, we only get mention of moms. James' mom was not shocked to hear information like this and said it was fine to let him sit there and that maybe he'll learn his lesson. The mother of David was immediately in Mr. Inman's office, was shocked and didn't understand why her son was still in trouble if James had admitted that he made David do this. So in the school district where we're at, the zero tolerance policy clearly states that students are required to have 45 days in the district's disciplinary alternative education program. So no wiggle room. All right, so moving forward, this case study exemplifies the struggle of following laws and board policies while remaining ethical. So in this specific case, there is no physical harm at this time. However, it is mentioned that James did threaten David, so there is a possibility of it. Definitely contravene of law, so felony possession of prohibited weapons, a breach of board policy, so the policy states that if students have weapons, then they follow the zero tolerance weapon policy, and Mr. Inman is required to file, and therefore the students will have to serve the 45 days. I found it to be discriminatory initially by the teacher who did witness the interaction. I thought it was interesting that she immediately jumped to the conclusion that James and David were exchanging drugs. So I thought that was, discriminatory towards James, and probably that she knows that he has had struggles in the past. And then I also think by Mr. Inman too, because even though he knows that James has been making progress, he went ahead and alerted that school resource officer immediately, which actually ends up being a mistake on his part, because that's why everything leads to the boys being taken to the detention center. Harassment is involved too, because James, he intimidated David to do what he wanted. He threatened him. So that is an important part of this case as well. All right, so my one sentence synthesizing the case: the ethical dilemma Mr. Inman faces is whether to follow legal and board policies, which is a requirement of his administrative position, or to advocate for David Ramos and follow his ethical beliefs in doing what will cause the least harm to the future of his students, ultimately due to his own errors in his initial decision-making in how to handle the situation. All right, so going over all of the facts, again, we have all of our people in the case. So we know Mr. Inman, the assistant principal, it's his first year. James is our student who has been struggling, and he is the one who initiated this conflict, this error on his judgment. He brought the weapons to school and then intimidated David to hold them and carry them throughout the day for him. David Ramos is a student who of exemplary behavior. He is an honor student. He's part of the music program, has never been in trouble, and is the victim of James' threats for him to carry the weapons for him. The teacher, I would assume it's that fifth period teacher who is the witness of the exchange between the boys. The school resource officer who was called in and then therefore acted by taking the boys to the detention center. The director of secondary education is also important because at the end of the case, we learn that Mr. Inman has chosen to not file the paperwork for David for him to be part of the 45-day suspension in the disciplinary alternative program. So therefore, he tells Mr. Inman that he will receive a written reprimand if he doesn't do so, and it will be part of his personnel file. David's mom, we hear from her. She is clearly very upset. Her son has never been in trouble, and she doesn't understand if the other boy did take ownership of what happened, why her son is in trouble. James' mom, who is supportive of the consequences her son receives, this is clearly not the first time they've been down this road before. There is no mention of the principal, but knowing that Mr. Inman is in the position of assistant principal, then we know that there is an acting principal, and they should be included on a big issue such as this with students now with the law and also violating Board of Education policies. Mention, again, central office kind of being tied in. The superintendent would at this point be included with such a big case. And then again, the Board of Education, because ultimately we're talking about violating those policies. Place. Okay, so this is Rocket Junior High, 900 students, like I said, so pretty big school. Grades are 7th to 9th grade. Did not specifically say that, but when you talk about a junior high is typically 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, as opposed to a middle school, which is 6th, 7th, and 8th. And then also just given the ages of the boys, so knowing that they are 13 and 15, I would think that probably puts the boys, James is probably a freshman, and then David probably a 7th grader, possibly 8th. So know that there's an area, the south side of town, so they don't give us a specific name of the city, but they do tell us that this specific area is one that has some difficulty. It's just kind of a harder area of town, and this is where James is coming from. So it's where they find a lot of students struggle at home as well. I'm guessing a more suburban area than rural, and like I said, the mention of the troubled area of town. And then the program itself, so we, like I said, I'm inferring that the grades are 7th to 9th grade. Again, the ages of the boys, James is 15, David 13. I believe it's probably a public school, knowing how much just the positions of teachers, the central office, also with knowing the types of programs that are being offered there. And then again, with the Board of Education being involved in those policies, as well as a school resource officer. School resource officers, I find, are typically found more so in public school settings than in private. So we do know some things about curriculum and courses because of mention from what David does. We know that honors programs and courses are offered because he is an honors student. We also know that there is a band, a music program, so that's part of the school as well. Okay. All right. So section 5, review and prioritize the information. So the ethical dilemma and consequences are damaging to every stakeholder involved. So for our assistant principal, Mr. Inman, so I think he's feeling a lot of consequences, probably personal consequences from himself and how he feels that he initially jumped to conclusion and immediately called that resource officer. I believe he should have taken some time to talk to the boys and should have called them in separately as well. But the big consequence he's looking at here, not only just, possible damage to his students' futures, damage with the parents, he is going to receive a formal reprimand in his personnel file if he does not do what he is expected to by following this board policy. David Ramos, big consequences for him. He has a bright future. He's a hardworking student, very smart and successful. And so this would have a huge impact on his future. It would be part of his student file, and it just really a lot of damage done to his future as a student and an adult. James, so sad for James. He has been making a lot of effort. And so this would, given that 45-day sentence and losing that relationship and that mentorship with Mr. Inman would be incredibly damaging to him, as he has really taken to that and is striving to make gains and efforts in his life. And so this would have a very negative impact on him as well as his family. It sounds like the relationship with his mom might be difficult, and that she was not very supportive when she received that phone call. Damage to the teacher. So I think, that teacher is probably feeling some responsibility for how quickly things developed, and, the way that initial judgment kind of led Mr. Inman to jump to the gun and alert the school resource officer. There will be damage to the principal as well. This is, a big issue, a lot of conflict, a lot of people involved. When you're the principal, you're invested in all of your students and your families, and you also have responsibility to, to lead your building in a way that is ethical but also following what is expected from the Board of Education. So a lot of effects for all the people involved. All the stakeholders have not been communicated with. They don't all know what's going on. We actually don't even know if the principal knows what's going on. So the superintendent, school board as well, we don't know. It was not mentioned, so I'm going to guess that they don't know what's going on either. Information provided, I believe it is sufficient enough in allowing me to advocate for an ethical decision to be made to promote the current and future success of the students involved. So, knowing the case and thinking about how I could handle this moving forward, I'm going to look at 6 different options and go over the consequences. So the first option is to just do nothing, to take no action and allow for the consequences to stay in place for David and James. Clearly very unethical in this situation. It's not what is best for students, and it is not promoting that. It's not best for James and David, so it is unethical to do nothing. Educational leaders, we need to stand up for our students and advocate for their rights and their future. So I struggled with that one. Negative impact on both students and their future and their families. And then also this will affect their parents as well. Option 2, excuse David and James from disciplinary action. So we're going to give a warning, no actual consequence, not going to the alternative education program. So this very clearly violates board policy. Board policy says there's a 0 tolerance. In this case, if you excuse James and David, then Mr. Inman is going to get that formal reprimand, that write-up in his file. And then we're also not enforcing the felony law. So option 3, excuse David from disciplinary action and enforce consequences for James. So again, breach of board policy because David had possession of the weapons, so he is supposed to receive those consequences. And then a negative impact on James and his personal growth. All right, option 4. So seek out all stakeholders to inform them of the situation, formulate and implement a plan of action together that dismisses David's consequences and changes James's consequences to suspension with home instruction. So this plan, instead of sending him to the alternative education program, it would keep him at home, and he would receive instruction from a teacher that would come into his home provided by the school district. So consequences with this, or cons, violates the policy of the board. When you bring in all the stakeholders, you're going to have so many opinions, and that can get tricky sometimes. The board may resist altering the consequences based on what their policy says. And then this also does have a minimizing effect to James' choices in bringing the weapons to school. Option 5. So seek out all stakeholders and inform them of the situation. Formulate and implement a plan of action together that dismisses David's consequences and changes James's consequences to in-school suspension. So he's going to receive 45 days of suspension in school. So again, violates that policy from the board. When you bring everyone in, too many opinions, the board may be resistant to alter the consequences, and it minimizes James' choices. Okay, option 6, seek out all stakeholders to inform them of the situation. Formulate and implement a plan of action together that dismisses David's consequences and changes James's consequences to in and out of school suspension. Discuss with the teacher her quick judgment of James, and set up counseling as well as a check-in with the resource officer for behavior, and continue to mentor James, and that would come from Mr. Inman. So, cons of this: violates that board policy. Again, lots of opinions. The board may be resistant to minimizing and altering those consequences. It minimizes James' choices. I realized on my slides I wrote David's. I'll fix that. But James' choices. Reluctance from the resource officer to invest in James however many times a week. That might be asking too much of him. And then a negative impact on the teacher, because you're going to have that difficult conversation that you feel like she made that prejudgment on James. All right, so now, section 7, we're going to evaluate the options, but this time looking at what the pros are. So number 1, taking no action, doing nothing. So I'm not going to review the cons this time. I'm just going to focus on the pros. Follows expectations from the board. Mr. Inman would have no formal reprimand, and it models to other students the zero tolerance policy and that it will be enforced. Number 2, excuse David and James from disciplinary action. So it protects the future for both of the students. And then you're probably going to have parental support from David's family for sure. Number 3, excuse David from disciplinary action and enforce James' consequences. So this protects David's future. And then you're going to get support from both of the families in this case, because James' mom was perfectly fine with him receiving consequences. All right, so looking at option number 4, seek out all stakeholders to inform them of the situation. Formulate and implement a plan of action together that dismisses David's consequences and changes James's consequences to out-of-school suspension with home instruction. So positives of this: it involves all stakeholders. The collaborative effort is a positive, to have all the stakeholders working together to determine what is best for the students. Protection of David's future, which is ethically what we should be doing. It supports James as well, who's been making effort and trying to improve his life. And then you're also going to get parental support, definitely from David's side. We don't know for sure where James' mom would land, but since he is still receiving some kind of consequences, I think she would probably be in support of that. Option number 5, seek out all stakeholders to inform them of the situation. Formulate and implement a plan of action together that dismisses David's consequences and changes James's consequences to in-school suspension. So again, it involves all the stakeholders, that collaborative effort, which is so important. It protects David's future. It supports James and the efforts he's been making, just really critical in order to continue that push for him to grow and be better and invest in his future. And then it allows Mr. Inman to mentor James, which I think is really important and critical in this case, and what is best for James. So by changing that suspension to an in-school suspension, it allows for that to still exist. And then I think, again, you'll get that parental support. All right, so last option, seek out all stakeholders to inform them of the situation. Formulate and implement a plan of action together that dismisses David's consequences and changes James' consequences to in and out of school suspension. Discuss with the teacher her quick judgment of James, and set up counseling as well as a check-in with the resource officer for behavior. Continue to mentor James. So, positives. Involves all stakeholders, collaborative effort to determine what is best for the students, supports James in the efforts he's been making, allows Mr. Inman to mentor James, which is huge, fosters that relationship between the two, parental support from both sets of parents, and then it's going to deter from future misjudgments from James. He is receiving a consequence that is a combination of some out of school time and in school suspension. And so I think the board might be more supportive of this kind of consequence because it is more serious for him to have 5 days out of school. I also like that for James, it's going to keep him present in school in a safe setting and a place where he will be invested in and supported. All right, section 8, choose the very best plan. All right, so the best option, I believe, is option number 6, which is seek out all stakeholders to inform them of the situation. Formulate and implement a plan of action together that dismisses David's consequences and changes James's consequences to in and out of school suspension. Discuss with teacher her quick judgment of James. Set up counseling with your school counselor, as well as a check-in with the resource officer for behavior, and then continue to mentor James. So, a couple of reasons that led me to believing that this is the best decision for James and for David is that, first of all, it involves all of the stakeholders. So it informs them, it allows the opportunity to work together and to collaborate. This is a pretty large conflict and discipline issue. So I think the more you involve the higher up parties, especially being that Mr. Inman is a first year administrator, it's important to have their support and their input as well. So that includes Mr. Inman, the Board of Education, because you're talking about board policies. And ultimately what you're asking is to alter that policy and the expectation of that. So you need to include them. The superintendent will need to be informed and part of the conversation as well, again, because of that board policy. The principal, it is, their building, and I'm sure being a principal, they probably have multiple years of experience. So it'll be important to survey them as well and include them because these are their his or her students as well. The resource officer to be part of the conversation because there was a violation of the law, and also we're ultimately asking, he or she we're asking them to kind of act like a parole type of officer and monitor James' behavior and check in with him. So he'll be an important part of the plan moving forward. Students are involved, obviously, James and David. The teacher who initially made the first report, she did the right thing by reporting, absolutely. If she has any type of observation that causes concern for her, then she did the right thing by alerting administration. Again, I think there was just that little prejudgment of what she knew about James and what she thought he was doing. Ultimately, she was right in that the situation was something that needed to be alerted to an administrator, but she was wrong in what she thought it was. And then the school counselor will be a big part of the plan moving forward for James, just to continue to provide him with support, teach him strategies, give him another adult that he can talk to. So this is showing care to all of those stakeholders, especially the students, but it's giving consideration for all the parties and how that situation is being handled. So in a lot of our research, when we talk about being an ethical leader, I know that in the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, they talked about seeking resources. So the resources in this case for Mr. Inman are going to be the people, because this is all brand new to him as well. So that will be a very, very important part for him. And then just, also, I know another thing that I've referenced here was from Scanlon, and that was just that it's important when we're creating like an ethical community in our schools that we're going to engage everyone in the whole community in that to create a moral learning environment. So I think that's really important. This also provides for open and honest relationships, and relationships are at the forefront of everything we do in education. And that is so, so, so important. And communication is a key factor in that. So I believe it is the most ethical decision because, ultimately, I know that something was done by James that was a violation of what is expected of him, and there should be consequences for that. However, I think what we need to remember is that ultimately what we want to do for our students is provide them with the most support to set them up for success right now in school, but also in their future. So, following this zero tolerance policy, although it does give consequences, it's going to have a hugely negative impact on James and his life, as well as David. So we need to remember that we need to consider the laws, but ethical decisions, they are more than that, and they're beyond just the laws. And so that was another thing that I remember reading, is just really keeping the best interest of students at the forefront of our decision making. And so, working together and being the advocate, Mr. Inman is being that advocate for pushing towards a decision that is going to be at the best interest of students and is really going to cultivate ethical decision making in all of those stakeholders. And he's really setting that tone for all of the stakeholders of where we could hopefully move forward in terms of the policies that are present in the school district. And then also just that consequentialism and utilitarian mindsets, and that information that we learned about, and just that really keeping at heart the least harm to the students. So yes, it's deserving of consequence, but what is going to provide the least harm to our students and their future? And that just how incredibly important that is. And then also just really balancing, what is the greatest good for them. So, and then this option really allowed for all of the stakeholders to be creative in what other options they had in terms of the consequences for the students, but not only consequences, but providing the students with the support they need, especially James, to ensure that we're setting him up for success and that we're providing him with the support and the resources to be successful in school as a student, and in his life. And for David, just making sure that we are not making a rash decision based on a policy that may be out of date and really has any direct correlation to David's life or his history. So, okay, so Section 9, implementing the decision. So putting the decision in action. So there are lots of steps that need to be taken here, and mostly it's grounded around collaborating with so many different stakeholders. So first, meet with the Board of Education and the superintendent, as well as the principal. So we're going to call in all of those important parties, maybe even possibly that director of secondary education, because they are the ones that called Mr. Inman with the initiative to write him up. And so we're going to start with presenting that alternative plan, and that just advocating that it promotes social justice for David and James. So again, I'm going to outline what the plan is. So no consequence for David. James would get 5 days of out of school suspension with home instruction, because for a kid like James, we don't want to lose that educational factor. We don't want to give him belief that not attending school it's okay. We want to provide that support, keep him engaged, and continue that positive push that he's had. And then we're going to do 40 days of the in-school suspension. And the reason why I kept it at 40 was because I thought it would be it would match the number of days that the policy had in place for what they should have been doing at the alternative disciplinary school program. So what I'd like to see happen in part of the plan is that we would monitor James' behavior and his commitment to staying with this discipline plan, how well he's doing at school, are there any issues? So if he is doing well and he's following through with what he is being asked, then possibly reduce those days for him. But the big thing, the key thing is that we're keeping him in the building because we're going to provide multiple resources and tools for him that he would not receive in that alternative discipline program, or if we just kept him suspended from school. So keeping him in the building is incredibly important. It's going to provide him with that relationship with Mr. Inman that's been so positive. It's going to provide the school counselor, and they're going to schedule sessions. And then also multiple check-ins weekly with the resource officer so that we know that he's complying with what's being asked of him. And then I think really big and important would be that Mr. Inman, I think there is some responsibility there in the fact that when this first was brought to his attention by the teacher, he reacted very quickly and called the school resource officer right away. And I really think that he should have talked to each boy separately and called them individually into his office and gathered facts and information and then included that school resource officer. So had he waited to do that, then none of this would be an issue for David at all. And then, so just, owning up to that part that Mr. Inman played. And then even just to promote that social justice for the students, agreeing to being written up if that's necessary, if the board feels that that is necessary for me to recognize that I'm not complying with that policy, then I would be willing, if I were Mr. Inman, to take that and put it in my file for what's best for my students. And then I think finally, just, as a collaborative group, really suggesting that we look at and we, have the courage to possibly reform these board policies that are not truly looking at the whole student. So I think that's a really important part of this process as well. Problems we might run into is that the board may not agree to the new discipline plan. And then therefore we're going to have negative impacts for James and David. And then if the plan is positively received, then a positive benefit would obviously be for the students, but then potentially moving forward to reform some outdated board policies. Okay, so secondly, then I would meet with the instructional team and share the plan. So this would be for James specifically. So I included in the instructional team, it would be his teachers, the school resource officer, the principal, the home instructor, the counselor, and James' parents. They need to be part of this collaborative effort as well. And so for the teachers, we want to start by, making appropriate plans for James while he is in suspension for his time at school, but also working collaboratively with the home instructor to make sure that we're on the same page in what is being taught. So that's a big thing. The counselor needs to be involved to determine how many sessions a week they should be meeting, what kind of things are they going to focus on, and then keeping the team updated with how the sessions are going. The school resource officer will determine how many check-ins James will receive a week. Is it daily? Is it a couple times a week? And then again, the 5 days are out of school with home instruction, 40 days of in-school suspension, which hopefully could be reduced, sessions with the counselor, check-ins with the resource officer, and continuing to foster that mentorship from Mr. Inman. So this is a really big undertaking for this team, and so there could be reluctance. Maybe teachers don't agree with it. Maybe the counselor or the resource officer don't have time to commit to it. But ultimately, the positive is that it's going to be such a big positive impact on James, and that's ultimately what we want. All right, so number 3, meet with David and his parents. And so this plan, it eliminated any consequences for David. So nothing on his record, no suspensions, anything like that. Also, an apology from Mr. Inman in how he handled the situation and taking ownership of the fact that incorporating and including that resource officer right off the bat, that caused a big issue in how things were then handled immediately after. And then I think it would be hugely important to address that he received threats, and yes, that is never okay, but he needs to have courage to speak out to an adult and seek and ask for help. I think that's a big thing, is that, ultimately we want to give our students the tools to guide them in life and to have the courage to stand up for something when they know it's not right, and to not be fearful of that threat and that intimidation that he received from James. So that's what I would want for David as a whole person. So big possible consequences. There could be some legal action from David's parents, and that he was taken to this detention facility and really had not truly done anything wrong. He was responding to harassment and a threat. And then they may have some defensive feelings about Mr. Inman, the assistant principal, encouraging David to speak out. So, all right, number 4, meet with the teacher. I think just hitting home that initial prejudgment of James really got kind of the ball rolling in this quick knee-jerk reaction from Mr. Inman. Mr. Inman is also responsible for that. And like I said prior, there was an issue that needed to be taken care of. So the teacher did the right thing by alerting the assistant principal. But I think what was present there was there was a prejudgment on her behalf when she was witnessing the students in their exchange. She knew James, probably knew his history, and therefore I think that had some stake in what happened with the situation. And then I think, also apologizing to the teacher that, I played a part in involving that school resource officer, and that Mr. Inman, that acting as me, that you're responsible for that. So, and, cons of this, it may damage the relationship with the teacher or discourage her from reporting in the future something that she witnesses, which I would hope not. So it would be important in that conversation to highlight and compliment that she did take action like she should have. So, okay. And then number 5, plan to have weekly meetings as an instructional team to report on James. So this will be really, really big. Once you get this plan in place, it's crucial that we follow up as a team every single week to stay on top of how the plan is working, especially if we get the board to agree to this alternative plan. It'll be important for us to communicate with the board and the superintendent how this is working for James, and that sharing any positive behavior changes that we see from him. So again, if successful, if James is doing really well, just decreasing that suspension time, I think it'll be really important for him to serve that time, but also to get back to a normal classroom setting. And then if James does violate the plan and doesn't hold up his end of the bargain, then I think it would be a very quick move to implementing that original zero tolerance consequence, because it is a big deal that he did have weapons at school, on school grounds. And then finally, just some of those, I'll go back, consequences from is that just that continued, positive would be that continued monitoring of the plan. That's really crucial to James and his success. And then if he is doing well, it's possible that because of that, the team may kind of loosen up how they're observing and their time as well. They might be more willing to skip a council session, skip a check-in if he's doing well. And it's really important that the team does not do that. Okay, so plan B. So if we hit a dead end here and this does not work out whatsoever, and my plan is not effective, then I would seek out the principal, because they are the ultimate leader of the building. And so surveying the principal will be really critical. But then I would also reach out to other assistant principals for advice on formulating a new discipline plan for James and David. Since Mr. Inman is a first year assistant principal, it's really good to talk to people who have experience and to get their advice. And then in the least, be sure to fight for David and protect his future since he was a victim in this situation. And then also, if James is required to complete the 45-day suspension in the disciplinary alternative education program, Mr. Inman or myself should continue to mentor him, check in with him, and foster that relationship. And then finally, these are my resources. And that is it. Thank you so much. I know I had a lot to say, so thank you for hanging in there with me. All right. Bye. Thanks.